debating, interviewing. You know that's what they doing. Stick around. It's about to get all roomy up in here. Remote Ruby starts now.
Chris Oliver, what's up?
Hey, what's going on, Andrew Mason?
Dude, there's some context to this. I have a podcast app that has transcripts, and every time it thinks that I'm Jason or Chris, and I'm like, I messaged Chris this week. I was like, Chris, this is driving me insane. We got to get our SEO up, bro.
There you go. Yeah. It'll just be AI answering it for you anyways in the future.
The podcast app I use, Snipped, it has like all this AI stuff built into it. It has transcripts, and you can ask the episode questions now, and it will like auto snip and like create summaries and stuff. I love it.
We should, on the podcast player side of things, we should make one that when you're like itching for another episode, it just generates one for you.
There we go. From all our past content.
Yeah. You just have more stuff to listen to whenever you need it on demand.
It's how we preserve Jason's voice forever.
Can't wait for it to be like introducing Rails 9 and everyone's freaking out. It's like, wait a minute.
Yeah, we just let it run. Let it run on a box under my bed.
Love it. Well, we've got Joe Masilotti with us today. Welcome back. It's been a while. I don't remember when we recorded last.
Last time we recorded, I feel like we had maybe just launched Jumpstart Pro. Is that wild? Is it that long ago?
Maybe.
It's been years.
It might be.
Yeah.
It might be. Andrew's the best at remembering this stuff, or is fastest to Google it.
April 30th, 2021 is what I see for remote Ruby. But we talked on Ruby for All since then.
Yeah.
Lots has changed since then, huh?
Dude, I've got a question. One of my goals this year was to actually follow through on my goal of building an iOS app. Like, no matter what it is, just build something. And I was talking to my coworker about it the other day, and I was like, in this day, if I was at Joe Masilotti's Turbo Native crash course way back when, and I was like, and he said, you just build a really good mobile UI. Like, it's easier to like port it over to iOS and Android. And I was like, yeah, we could use Strata. And my coworker was like, what's Strata? And I opened up the Hotwire homepage, and I was like, I don't know, because it's gone. So, because I haven't worked on any of this in a while. I told both of y'all that I have been very deep into web and not thinking about iOS native at all recently. And I want to know what happened, where to go.
Yeah. So there's a lot of backstory with this one. Let's start where we are now. Hotwire Native is the latest in how to build companion iOS and Android apps for your Rails app. You build some native code, it wraps your Rails app in a web view, you add some native features, you submit to the app stores, users can download your app. You can get by with 50 lines of code for a lot of things. It's pretty awesome. Or you can dive deeper and integrate with native APIs. The world is your oyster because you're writing native Swift and native Kotlin. That's where we are now. That's like the good state of things. But to get here took a decade, I think. So rewind this, I want to say like almost 10 years at this point. Basecamp, they had a product called Turbo Links, which that probably sends some tremors through some Rails developers, because Turbo Links came out and was like, all our JavaScript was broken. Turbo Links was a way to hijack page clicks and make things faster by doing JavaScript requests instead of HTML and XHRs, so we didn't refresh the head. What it added was this thing called Turbo Links iOS and Turbo Links Android. And that was a way to wrap your Rails app in a very bare bones native wrapper. Did the same thing, rendered a web view. Wasn't ready for prime time. I was lucky enough that my CTO at the time for the company I was working for had some ties with DHH, and we were given early access to this thing, Turbo Links iOS and Turbo Links Android. We'd released an app in a few months, I think, got it in the App Store and Google Play, worked great. But it never really was easy to work with. You had to handle a lot of low-level stuff. Fast forward a few years, it finally became open source. People could use it. It was getting more feedback. Not a lot of adoption because it was so hard to use. It was so hard to interact with these apps. Fast forward a few more years, Hotwire comes out, Hotwire on the web. And with Hotwire on the web, it was rebranded to Turbo iOS and Turbo Android. just like Turbo JavaScript was renamed from TurboLinks to Turbo.js. So now we have Turbo iOS and Turbo Android. What changed? Nothing. Almost nothing changed. It was the exact same. It pointed to a different JavaScript CDN. Like that was like the short of it. It didn't add any features. It didn't add any functionality. It made it a tiny bit easier to deal with some stuff. For the most part, it was you were on your own building these apps, and it was hard. And that was the case up until about a year ago. Finally, I started working with 37 Signals directly and helping them make the libraries better. I was working with Jay Ohms over there, who's the lead Android developer, the lead mobile developer over there. And we were just like, this is so much work to get iOS and Android apps off the ground. Let's fix that. So while that's happening, Strata came out. Strata is a way to do JavaScript messages and add little components to your app. It didn't really solve the problems that people were asking for. It added more confusion. And we were like, this is absolutely ridiculous. We need a rebrand. We need a fresh start. So we combined Strata and we combined Turbo Native into something called Hotwire Native. And now if you go to hotwire.dev, there's the third bullet point. It's Stimulus, it's Turbo, and now it's Native. It's not Strata, it's just Hotwire Native. And that is this all-encompassing thing of anything you want to do native is in this single package. There's one for iOS, there's one for Android. It has Strata, which have been renamed to Bridge components. Some apps will use it, some apps won't. But you can get that. I have a YouTube video on this. An iOS app can be 15 lines of code now. An Android app can be like 25 lines of code. And you have full-on native interactions, rendering your web view, all of this great stuff with very little code because we've abstracted so much of it underneath the hood in just making sure that it's easy for Rails developers specifically to get started on these frameworks. And that's where we are today. 1.1.1 came out a few weeks ago, which adds some tiny improvements to external URLs. But for the most part, it's been battle tested for years because it's just been rebranded, but we have everything under the same umbrella right now. So it's even easier for folks to get started.
That makes a lot of sense.
This was all like powering Basecamp and Hey as mobile apps to Basecamp for a long time. But then Hey more recently, whenever, I forget when Hey launched, 2022 or whatever. But they have run, and you've run it, for years and years and years. And it's like all those little warts and little things over the years that have finally been figured out and now put together in a cohesive package. Because originally TurboLinks didn't even handle form submissions, which is the big thing that Hotwire with Turbo solved, which was one of the problems. Is I submit a form and then it's got to re-download the JavaScript or parse it in CSS and everything, repaint it all. That was taking you out of that mobile experience because it all of a sudden was slow after you submitted a form rather than the experience you want, which is a single page app without having to do all that front end JavaScript to take over everything. Were there a lot of things in that transition period from TurboLinks iOS and Android to Turbo iOS and Android that just magically kind of disappeared because now the framework helped with a lot of those things?
Yeah, the TurboLinks to Turbo was pretty minimal. There wasn't really much improvement other than it was using Turbo V5 instead of TurboLinks, whatever, V3. The big improvements when we jumped from Turbo to Hotwire Native were a lot of something called URL handling. So Turbo iOS, if you wanted to do what you just said, click a link, open it in a modal, have it slide up from the bottom of the page, submit that form, and refresh the page underneath after dismissing the page. So that's a very common iOS and Android interaction. You click a link or a button, page slides up from the bottom, you submit the form, it disappears, and the page underneath refreshes. You had to handle all of that manually. If you look at old Jumpstart Pro iOS code bases, we have 150 line class that does all of that just for handling interactions like that. And we've essentially upstreamed all of the routing into Hotwire Native now. So now you need one line of configuration that says URLs that look like this should be presented in a modal. And all of that stuff is handled for you. It has 15 different paths it can take. It's Am I visiting the same page? Okay, just refresh it. Don't put a new page on the stack. Am I visiting the previous page? Okay, pop the page and then refresh. Am I visiting a modal, et cetera, et cetera? All these 15 different interactions. And that came from a library, if anyone's heard of, what was it? Turbo Navigator. I think it was what I had for a while. That's now been deprecated because we don't need it anymore. But Turbo Navigator, we had working in Jumpstart Pro. I kind of extracted it to be more general in Turbo Navigator. Now that has been upstreamed into Hotwire Native. So everyone gets it for free and can just click a link and what is expected happens. You don't have to worry about managing stacks and modals and popping and pushing screens. It's just visit this page, visit that page. So that was the biggest improvement outside of bundling in the Strata, or formerly known as Strata components, into one package.
As we did the first version of Jumpstart iOS, I remember lots of those things were like, I remember like, we'll just do it this way on the web, and we do it the normal way we might tend to do things. But then when you turn it into a mobile app, there's actually a lot of different types of interactions that you want to have that make it feel native. And that was something new to me because I was like, oh, just used Twitter and everything else on my phone, Instagram, whatever else. And it just feels natural. But then you embed your web app in there and you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't feel natural anymore. I need a native tab bar at the bottom. I need a nav bar at the top, or whatever it is, a floating icon to create a new post or something like on Android. Those things actually make a big difference on how it feels. And that was like a really interesting thing for me, which maybe you take for granted having done this for so long. But for me, it was like, oh crap, even the navigation needs to be different from a responsive mobile web view. We need to actually like completely hide the nav bar on native and when it's embedded, because we want to use the native nav bar, but we still need that menu to be triggered and displayed somehow. So it was been a lot of fun to like learn that stuff, but it was like, dang, there's way more nuance to it all than I realized. Just kind of sounds like slap your app in a web view and you're done. But it's not really the case.
Yeah, a lot of those interactions we put a lot of time and thought into because we had to think about it for Jumpstart in a very general sense. We couldn't say page A goes to page B this way, page C goes to page D that way. We had to think about a user going from anywhere in the app to anywhere else in the app. And we had to abstract that for the template. So the thinking that we did and all of those video calls that we had over those 6 months while we built it out, that's what really powered the Turbo Navigator logic. It was like, here's the generic way of handling everything. Now we can figure out how to upstream it into the library in a way that works for not only a template, but for everything. And like I said, 15 different cases pulled out of that. If you want to look in some really interesting iOS and Android code, check out the Turbo Navigation Hierarchy Controller, which deals with all of the different pushing and popping and presenting and dismissing of screens in the repos, because there is a lot of logic in there just around making sure that we keep a solid, like you said, mental model of what's going on.
It's a good thing to have in mind while you're developing too. Now that I have gone through that with you, I now think about a lot of these things with that in mind, where I might shove something into the nav bar and you're like, well, actually on mobile, we'd want this as one of the dedicated tabs. And then you can decide how you want to design stuff. What else changed? Like, I know authentication was something that I don't know back in the day with TurboLinks iOS and Android if there was anything at all. But I know when we got to Hotwire Native doing authentication where we need to log in natively so we can get an API token, but also set cookies for the web views, that was tricky. It wasn't too hard to implement, but it was just annoying to have to keep two authentication systems in sync.
Yeah, so one of the big things with a Turbo Native app back then, right? That's what we built it on, was that it was kind of convoluted of sharing stuff between the web view and native. There was no real best practice, or how do we get cookies out of the web view and into the native HTTP storage and vice versa. And that's been cleaned up really nicely in Hotwire Native with, surprisingly, of course, it's always just one line of code, right? So now, instead of requiring native authentication where you have to build out an API endpoint and a native Swift UI screen and a networking stack all natively, the recommendation is to do authentication with your default web view, your /user/sign in or /session/new. And what happens there is that when you sign in, those long-lived cookies just get persisted to disk automatically now. So you set your session cookie, you set your long-lived remember me token cookie. Those get set and persisted to disk and last now between app launches out of the box. You don't have to do anything around that. The Hotwire Native respects the expires at token or value in the cookie. So you can use your web-based auth, which sounds really silly or sounds really like a small improvement. But the amount of times that I've seen I had to come back and help clients with their apps because they added a single checkbox or they added a new form to their sign in or sign up flow is double digits. And now that can be all done just by deploying a new change to your Rails server. Your sign in screen updates on the web, your sign in screen updates on your native apps. And it just reduces the barrier to entry immensely. It reduces your maintenance cost dramatically. And it makes it more obvious about what's going on. You have a cookie, and that's how the user is signed in. That's how they're signed in on the web. It's how they're signed in on the native apps. The kind of like conceptual difference is that you also then use that web cookie, stay with me here, to authenticate JSON requests. So you're making an
request.
Yeah, you're making an API request. So let's say you need to do push notifications. You got to find a way to get the token from the device to the server so you know who to send it to. You make an HTTP request from the client. We don't send an auth token or a JWT. We're just having the cookie come along for the ride, which is a little weird, which might not be the best practice in terms of like how you want to do all of this stuff. But it means that your server can handle authentication with just cookies. You don't have to worry about, is this coming from the app or not? It's just, is there a cookie? You can use your regular device, user signed in, all that good stuff. And it means that when you invalidate or clear that cookie, both the native HTTP requests and the web view get signed out at the same time. You don't have to manage two different things. And again, just makes it easier for Rails developers to build mobile apps. That's how it works on the web. That's how it's going to work in Hotwire Native. And coming to terms with those goals, those North Stars, made Hotwire Native just the features so obvious all of a sudden. It's like, oh yeah, web-based auth. That's the recommendation. And that's what I talk about in my teaching. Whenever I write about this, it's like, go web-based auth until you have to go native.
And just for some clarity, if you haven't done this before, the token you're referring to is like the device token for receiving notifications through like Apple's push notification service. It's not a API token or whatever.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. And really like all this has done is made the native HTTP client simulate how the browser treats cookies. And it's like when it expires. And when we get new cookies back, we use the exact same process the browser is going to do. So that makes life so much easier because it's basically the exact same thing for everything. And if you hit a JSON endpoint, it's like, normally we have a token. Is this secure to do it with cookies? Absolutely. Yeah. That's exactly what you're going to do in your browser anyways with the fetch request. So it's literally no different than how the browser works, so long as the cookies are treated the same way. And that's about it, which is cool.
Yeah, exactly. I think the only thing that I'll add to that is that CSRF. So you'll have to disable CSRF for those endpoints, or at least if they're JSON requests, because you won't have a CSRF token coming from the native APIs requests. But if you're okay with that on a few endpoints, or you only grant it for the user agent or what have you, it can make your life a lot easier by just not worrying about that.
Right. If you treat it as that's required for a non-native request or whatever, in general, those requests are coming from your application. So it makes sense that it doesn't need to load the page because there's not going to be, well, people could try to abuse those outside of the mobile app, but that might be something in the future. There's maybe a fancier way of handling and securing those from the application or something. But it's like a request that you already know where it's coming from.
And it's authenticated. You're never opening an endpoint for unauthenticated users with CSRF disabled. it's always an authenticated endpoint. So you have a little bit of layer of security where it's like, at least I know who's trying to do something.
Production monitoring can be complicated. There are tons of tools and techniques, but you just want to know that your app is up and your users are happy. When your customers encounter a problem, you need clear, actionable intelligence, not walls of charts and reams of logs. That's why they built Honeybadger, the monitoring tool you've always wanted, a tool that's there when you need it and gets out of your way when you don't. With Honeybadger, you'll know when critical errors occur and which customers are affected. You'll be able to respond instantly when your systems go down and improve the health of your systems over time. Plus, you can fix problems before your customers can even report them. Honeybadger is the application health monitoring tool built for you, the developer who cares about a quality product and happy customers. Start monitoring today at honeybadger.io. It's free to get started and setup takes less than 5 minutes. Once again, that's www.honeybadger.io. Notifications are probably the other major thing that PWAs can do, and Rails is going to have some web push stuff with the PWAs, but that's the device token you were talking about for notifications. That stuff is interesting, the way we've set it up, where like we have multiple accounts in Jumpstart. So the dot that you want to display of unread notifications is kind of like very similar to most applications like X, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, wherever you might have multiple accounts. You want to show the unread total, but each individual account has different numbers. And so like you have to manage all that, which is interesting. That's one of those things where Strata or bridge components, as they're now called, comes into play for us. You want to explain how those work?
Yeah, that's a great example. So I think that it just really proves the point of one of the, like what I kind of call the Hotwire Native mindset of keeping as much logic as possible on the server. What that means here is that you're signed into an account on your app, but you have multiple accounts that you can switch between. And maybe account A has 2 notifications that are unread and account B has 3 notifications. So you want to display 2 + 3, 5 on the home screen. You don't want the iOS or the Android app to have to calculate those for you. So what we do in Jumpstart is that we have a bridge component that every time the page loads, we send over the wire, hey, here's the unread notifications for the account that's currently signed in. And here's the unread notification count for your total, all the accounts that you have authentication to. And what that means is that we can set a little badge on the tab bar, like a 2, and then we can set a 5 on the home screen. But the iOS app and the Android app, all they see is 2 numbers and they know where to set them. They don't know what the difference is. They don't know why there's a difference. They don't even care if they're different. All we do is just say, these are the numbers, that's where they go. And it leaves, oh my God, just a slew of logic on the server. Let's just think about having the client needing to know that multiple accounts are signed in. The client needing to make fetch requests or get requests for saying, how many unread do I have for this account? Doing the logic of adding them up. Doing the logic of like when they open one, marking it as read and updating the count. All of that is done on the server because every page load updates those counts for you with the bridge component. So now they read notification number 3, they just get a new message that's like, hey, now the counts are 1 and 4 or 1 and 2 or whatever the math works out to be. But they don't have to worry about doing any of the math or doing any of the logic. And that's huge. That is removing, yes, you don't want to duplicate it on iOS and Rails, but you also don't want to duplicate it on Android. Now you have it all in one spot in that single bridge component or your Rails code, which is also just like a little bit easier to code too. So it's a win-win.
That is, like you mentioned maintenance earlier, and that stood out as something we should talk about. The more stuff you move into native, the more maintenance it's going to be, where every upgrade of iOS or Android or whatever might require you to go refactor some code or use a new API or something. Or it makes it so that older Apple devices or whatever can't run this now because yada yada has changed and this device is too old. How much maintenance does like the average app need on Hotwire Native from stuff you built?
The short answer is that if you're not adding new native features, very, very little maintenance is required. Where I used to work before I went independent, we had an app in the App Store for multiple years without getting any native updates.
Wow.
But we were deploying new Rails features every 2 weeks because the Rails features would just bubble down to the apps. We added a new link to this page, and now we have a new feature. It wasn't until Apple said to us, hey, we're going to remove your app from the App Store because you haven't updated it in 2 years. Did we have to do anything? And
wow.
yeah, that's what pushed us to make a change. And all we did was rebuild the app and resubmit. You have to update every now and then for Apple to be happy. But they thought the app was stagnant, right? Because we hadn't updated the native code in so long. But we were getting new features to their businesses and to our customers every single 2 weeks because of new Rails stuff. So obviously that's one end of the spectrum, right? That's like the best case scenario. But I find that's pretty common. If you're adding only Rails features, you don't need to touch the native code once you have something working in the app stores. If you want to add a new native integration, or you would need to, let's say you want to integrate with HealthKit now and you weren't before, like, yeah, that's going to require native code. That's going to require an app store update. That's going to require native changes. But if you're just doing Rails stuff and you're fixing bugs on the server and you're adding new features to new endpoints and stuff, that app can just stay in the app stores for a long time, And it's pretty wild. I come back and work with clients pretty frequently because they want to add new features, or we did like an MVP V1 to see if it would work. And then they come back 6 months and they're like, all right, now let's do the real thing. But it's rare that I have to come back to clients because of bug fixes or because of, hey, this doesn't work anymore. That's all usually fixed through the Rails server. And once I disengage from a client, their Rails developers just fix those bugs or add those features themselves. It's pretty wild.
That's really cool. Are there many dependencies at all for Hotwire Native that are like third-party things, or any at all?
No, it has no dependencies. The
Nice.
iOS app,
Yeah.
the Android app depends on some JSON parsing library, but it's like first party from Google and
Yeah.
some fragment stuff. But Android's a whole different beast. It depends on first party libraries. That's it.
Well, that's good, because that's kind of the stuff that the Rails upgrades are hard because you added 50 gems and
Yeah.
40 of them only work with Ruby 3 or 2.7 and not 3 and whatever. That stuff becomes tough, which is partly why the Hotwire Native stuff sounds like it's that maintainable. A lot of the APIs you're going to integrate with, like maps, are probably going to be pretty darn stable because they can't go and break a lot of things, because how many apps are already in there using Apple Maps or Google Maps? That stuff would be horrendous for them to break at this point. So if you're sticking to those types of things where it's minimal dependencies, which sounds like Hotwire Native is really the only dependency for the most part, then super stable. And then maybe if you add an integration to HealthKit or something, like, they're not probably removing a lot of stuff at this point. They might change something around, but it would probably be minimal for the most part. And if it's not, at that point, you probably have a full-time native developer on your team to maintain those more complex things, I would guess.
Yeah, and the good thing with the apps is they're packaged and bundled and deployed. Even if, let's say, HealthKit deprecates something in the future that you were using, it'll still be 2 years before it's removed. But let's say it's 2 years later and you still haven't updated your app. It's not until you go and rebuild your app in Xcode or Android Studio that you'll lose access to that feature. You're still bundled with the code that's required to do all the things your app does. So you're even safer if changes are made until you need to go and rebuild your app for whatever reason. Yeah, if you wait 2 years and then open up the new version of Xcode or Android Studio, you're probably going to have a lot of deprecation warnings, and like Swift or Kotlin's going to be updated and stuff. But it's usually you hit the migration tool and it's like, all right, here's the 5 lines of code that you want to watch out for. You Google those or throw those in ChatGPT and you're good to go. But it's rare, unless you're doing stuff with a third-party library, that you'll come into something that's like a real maintenance issue.
That is real good, confidence inspiring for anybody that wants to take their app and make a mobile version of it. Because my fear would be like, yeah, we launched the mobile app of something, and now all of a sudden I'm doing lots of maintenance all the time on keeping that up to date and keeping track of the iOS and Android APIs that are changing and whatever. Like, it would be a lot of work. And we've seen that in the past with keeping up with Webpacker changes or whatever. That kind of stuff is like sometimes adopting these new things can be a big maintenance burden and really problematic. But I don't think this is the case. And also, like, Hotwire Native is being used by Basecamp and Hey. And so, like, new iOS and Android versions come out, you'll be there updating them to make sure it's going to be compatible or whatever. Like, the teams working on it, they're going to keep it up to date. So it's a library that you'll be able to trust that won't just go stagnant over time, since it's being used in production by enough people.
Yeah, that's a good point. The Turbo Native to Hotwire Native migration is non-trivial for sure. Like, if you had a Turbo Native app, moving to Hotwire Native will require some work for sure. But from the 5 or so apps that I've migrated, you end up deleting 10 times as much code as you end up adding, because so much of what you're doing is already embedded in the framework now. But it does require a good upgrade. It's a good Rails 4 to 5 upgrade, not a fun one. It's not like a Rails 6 to 7 upgrade where it's okay, some JavaScript stuff changed. And that's significant for sure. But we're now at a point where we're at a really stable release because Basecamp is using the actual library, not some fork of it like they were before. Apps in the production in the App Store are no longer needing to fork this to do their own custom things. Those have all been rolled up and are in the library. So we now have a true, what I consider like open source library where people are using the code as is and not running their own versions of it. So it took us 10 years, but it's become much more stable over the past like 6 months to a year because we've actually started to listen to that feedback and integrate it into the library and not just been like, sorry, that's up to you. We're taking it more seriously, I think is the short of it.
That's really good to hear, because I think that was probably a lot of people's concern of adopting it when it didn't seem like it got a lot of maintenance and whatever. But it takes time to see enough projects to make something open source that fits all of those use cases. You've got an impossible problem to solve when you start with, I need to build it for myself, but I plan to open source it and I need to make it work for every single use case ever. Until you've seen like 50 or 100 different use cases that weren't things you could even imagine back then, eventually you can finally get to that point where I've seen enough things. I know generally what we want to support, what we don't want to support, what this should feel like. And it takes a lot of time to get to that point. And yes, it took 10 years or whatever, but it also didn't get sort of the same overwhelming use as like Rails itself did.
Yeah.
So it takes more time because there was far fewer people using it. But on that note, you've got a book coming out about it, which means that way more people hopefully will be using Hotwire Native. So I would love to hear, did you reach out about doing the book? Did they reach out to you? Like, how did the process go?
Yeah. So what is this? January 2025. So August 2023, I decided to write a book. I was on vacation in Australia. We were going to the Women's World Cup. My wife and I and our 2 best friends got tickets. And I was like, I'm going to write a book on Turbo Native at the time because it's been so long, like such a long time coming. So I just sat down in Notion and I wrote 4 chapters over 2 weeks. Just went for it. And I almost immediately lost interest. I was just like, all right, I don't want to do this anymore. You know, ADHD brain. I was super, super excited about it. And then I like lost interest when it got hard and didn't want to finish. So I was like, I need to get a publisher. So I reached out to 3 different I was planning on self-publishing at the time. I reached out to 3 different publishers, and Pragmatic Bookshelf replied like almost immediately. And they were like, yeah, like, let's go. We're going to get you set up with Noel Rappin, who's doing the Rails arc for them. And that was in January of 2024. We signed the contract and started writing. And it was kind of just off to the races there. Like, I had a few chapters, but I was working with my editor. We got calendar going. And she's like, just a heads up, it's probably going to take 2 years. And I was like, no, books don't take 2 years. And what's funny is that by the time this book will be a physical release, it will probably be about 2 years since I started. like almost to the day. But as of now, the early access is available. You can buy it on Pragmatic Bookshelf. I have links and banners all over my website on masilotti.com with some more info about the book and all that stuff. And there'll be a link in the show notes. Of course, what is it? There's going to be 10 chapters, and it is written for Rails developers. This book assumes zero native experience. If you know how to do a CRUD Rails app and create a stimulus controller, you can work through the entirety of this book. Everything else is taught to you. How to download Xcode, how to install Android Studio, how to write Swift, how to write Kotlin. Through the 10 chapters, you'll build up an app working with a companion Rails app that I provide the code for as well, and learn how to build iOS, how to do Android, how to use the path configuration, native tab bar, Swift UI, Jetpack Compose, push notifications, bridge components, test flight, pretty much everything you'll need to build a good portion of any iOS or Android app powered by Hotwire Native. With the goal being at the end of it that you have the app running on your local machine. You got your Rails server running locally, and you have a physical device in your hand pointing to that, downloaded from Test Flight or Google Play internal testing, and are able to then deploy to production if you wanted to. So it's going to take you through everything all the way until you want to hit submit to App Store.
Super awesome. This is the book for you, Andrew.
Yeah, that sounds exactly like what I need. I don't think Swift is that bad. I was curious how much like into the languages you go, because I've never touched Kotlin because I don't believe in Kotlin, but I don't think it exists, just to be very clear. But I have written some Swift, and I don't find it that difficult at all. So I'm just curious, like what level you go into.
At the beginning, I don't go into the languages at all. It's like, copy this line of code, paste this, do that, do this. And then by the end, we're diving into what's an optional, what's a let versus a val, like the equivalent in JavaScript, how do constants work, what are protocols, delegates. Every chapter introduces maybe 2 or 3 native language features, but only the ones that you absolutely need for that chapter. So by the end, I think you'll be able to read Swift and Kotlin. I don't know if you'd be able to write anything in Swift and Kotlin, but you would definitely know the right questions to ask Google or ask ChatGPT to figure out how to build what you want to know next. And that's the goal of it. I want to get you like dangerous with the language, but not fully competent that you could write anything, because the book would just be 1,000 pages.
Nice. That sounds perfect.
And I try to relate every single new feature of a language, like optionals, to Ruby. So it's meant for Rails developers. So every time I introduce something, it's like, and here's how that would look in Rails, or here's how that would look in Ruby. And it paints a really nice picture because you can draw these parallels between the 3 languages and realize, oh, Swift and Kotlin are actually really similar. And Ruby shares some roots, but it's also totally its own thing. And here's how that's good and how that's bad.
Nice.
I got the early preview of the book, and that stuff was very helpful to me because it's been a long time since I did any Swift. Yeah. And it was great refresher of like, language is something that I understand, but looking at it, it feels so different from Ruby. And those little nuances that you explained that go back and forth really made it so much easier to get through those portions where I'm like, I'll probably forget this tomorrow, but at least I know where to go back and look for it. And that really is the biggest hurdle for most people, I would say. Like my biggest struggle was the language of Swift and the differences. And like, I know how to do this in Ruby. How do I translate that to Swift? And then also the MVC architecture of how I do it in Ruby. And then how does that fit into the approach I should be using for an iOS app or Android? And like, those were the 2 main struggles for me. It was like just the mental model and then like translating between languages, which is like, if you're learning a foreign language like Spanish or something, that part feels very similar where you're like, you start to piece that together and then it becomes very natural over time. The hardest part I felt like was the like mental model of the structure of this needs to be different than the structure of my Ruby apps or whatever.
I made the decision early on with the structure of the book, but also the structure of the code. I'm not teaching perfect best practices of iOS and Android apps. If a senior iOS developer looked at the code you'd write, they'd probably be like, this is a little weird. Like, we don't normally do it this way. And that's on purpose. I'm teaching you how to do things that relate to a Rails developer. So like Swift and Kotlin especially normally separates their features into directories and folders. So like this will be like all the web features are in one folder. That's not usually how it happens on a Rails app. It's usually like, here's all your controllers and here's all your views. Here's all your whatevers. And I mimic that on the iOS and Android apps so you can have the same directory structure across all three platforms. And just that little bit of change makes it so much easier for a Rails developer to be like, oh, where is this model? It's in the models package or the models directory. You don't have to think about, oh, on Android, I think about it this way. It's just all the same. And that's helped a lot of, from feedback I've heard, it helped a lot of Rails developers like bridge that gap and be like, I know where to find things because it just mimics my Rails app. And that's big.
Probably helps a lot on the maintenance too, where you don't touch that for 2 years and you come back and you're like, oh, it was in the model. I remember now. Like it starts to help in the long term, probably a ton with that. I was curious, like, how long did it take to figure out like how you wanted to structure the book? Like introducing Swift and those little nuances are a big challenge, I would assume, writing a book this long and getting into the writing and realizing like, oh crap, I didn't realize I need to explain this and I have to go back and change that. It's probably a lot of the 2 years why it took so long, I would guess.
Yeah, I am constantly reordering and rejiggering chapters and code and concepts. Yesterday morning, I was working on the bridge component chapter for Android. So it's going to be a little button that you add to the top right of your screen to submit forms, and it's going to have a dynamic text and dynamic image that you pull from the server and stuff. And I had this outline of how all the code was going to work. I had all the commits lined up. And then I realized that commit 14 introduced a concept in Kotlin that we hadn't talked about yet. So I was like, oh crap, now I got to take this huge sidebar to talk about this question mark period or the Elvis operator. And it didn't make any sense at the time. So I had to reorder almost the entire chapter, reorder the entire how I talked about it, just to make sure that it flowed better for the reader, even if it wasn't like the way you'd build it in real life. Another example is chapters 9 and 10, deploy to physical devices and then push notifications. Normally, I would say deploy to physical devices would be the last chapter of the book. Makes the most sense. Like you've done all the coding. Now let's just get it in the app store, so to speak. But to send push notifications, you have to have a registered app with the App Store, even if it's not in the App Store, but it has to be registered with Apple and Google. So those two chapters had to flip. And now I have to talk about like registering your app before we even do push notifications, just because you need a bundle identifier, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even little things like that, where I'm switching chapter order to have the flow work better, has been challenging because it's not just sit down and write. It's like sit down and write and then edit and then edit and then edit and then edit some more and then write a little bit and then edit and then edit. One of the cool things that's been fun to work with this is I have all of the code needs to be packaged somewhere in a zip file for readers to download so they can have checkpoints along the way. And the way that I have that working is I have a Git repo that has all of the code, and each commit is prefixed with chapter 1, commit 1, chapter 1, commit 2. And then it goes all the way up to chapter 10, 35 or whatever, right? So there's like 300 commits. I have a Ruby script that iterates through all of my commits, so walks the Git tree and copies over the entire directory of code at that point into the book directory. But what that means is that my commits need to be perfect. So if I had to change commit 3 versus 4, I have to go and rewrite history to make it perfect. So I have become Git professional. Like I'm in the Git ref logs all the time. I'm rebasing. I'm leaving dangling commits and pulling them in on interactive rebases. Like all of this crazy Git stuff I never had to worry about. And I've gotten so good at Git in a way that I never thought I would have to be just to order the code for the book. So meta. But that's been a lot of fun. And I feel like I could teach an entire course on just like how to fix up commit 3 in a 300 commit history.
I was
your
literally
next
going to
book.
ask, how many times have you done interactive rebases to fix like the history?
Okay, just rewriting that chapter the other day, I rebased interactively probably 35 times.
Dude, that's my signature move. You know, I've been in the code base when you see rebases all over the place.
Each commit has to show what new lines were added. It doesn't know it from the git diff. Like you have to actually say like a comment, start highlight, and then end highlight. And then when it gets propagated into the book, it'll do a little arrow next to those 2 lines to show which lines changed. But that means that the git changes and the diffs between each file are even more complex because you have to worry about moving the highlights and moving the code that you want to show versus the code you want to hide because it's not relevant. So every change is like, even if I change commit 3, I then have to manually edit 4 through 305 because of all the changes that happened.
Oh.
It's like, it is a nightmare.
We had a tiny version of that with the Rails getting started guide.
Yeah.
When I rewrote that, like, we don't need the commit history to be like you do, but we do need to highlight those individual lines in the snippets. And it was like the markdown parser or whatever would just read the first word of the Ruby block or the JavaScript block or something. And so if I gave it a space, which is supposed to be supported by Markdown, and you could say like the language Ruby and then like highlight equals 2,3 or something.
Yeah.
That would just ignore everything after Ruby. And I was like, oh man, this sucks. And then it became really tough because we would do the same reordering. And then it was like, well, I need to add this line of code way back up here, which means that every chunk of that same file we need to like keep in sync. Even if we're highlighting different lines, the other code in that block needs to stay the same. And that sounds like fascinating. I'd be curious to see that Ruby script. And that's a pretty cool thing that maybe isn't particularly useful for a ton of people, but any like content creator like myself, that probably is pretty cool to see. I'd be real curious to see how that works.
Also, the script itself, like it's iterating through the tree, but it also needs to be aware of Git in a way that it's not copying over files in gitignore. So I have to actually ask Git at every commit, what are the files that you're tracking here? Can't just do a CPR -R. I actually have to say, hey, Git, give me the list of files, then pipe that into a copy recursively to make sure I don't add like node modules or what have you, or my secret key because it was in gitignore and stuff like that. So it's a pretty cool script, and I definitely would not have been able to write it without help from AI because that is not my forte. But it is written in Ruby, which I thought was fun.
Yeah, Ruby's a good language for doing that kind of stuff.
Especially if you don't care about the error messages. It's just like if it fails and you don't have to parse error message and you're not doing like, what is it, like POP3 or whatever. You're just doing like backticks to execute stuff.
Yeah, like open. Yeah,
Open
that's true.
Whatever.
Yeah.
And at least you get the Ruby stack trace when you have to debug which one went wrong. You'll get the error message or whatever from the command you wrote. But
exactly.
When your logic in your script is wrong, you're not like dealing with debugging a bash script, which is way less fun.
Hey, man, that's what I do on my weekends. Don't judge us bash writers. Well, I only write ZSH, but
that was the other
we're
thing
not bashing on your bash.
ZSH versus bash versus whatever. I was like, no, we're going to have a Ruby executable and you're going to call Ruby on it and it's going to do its thing.
What other interesting challenges did you have right in the book?
The biggest challenge is that when I sit down to write, it's oftentimes I'm not writing. Every time I get to a chapter, I have to figure out what code is being added. What's the order of that code? How do I introduce that code in a way, like I said before, that introduces concepts in a linear fashion? I have to do multiple hours of work before I can actually start writing. Welcome to chapter 9. In this chapter, we're going to learn X, Y, and Z. And it's just so not how I've written in the past. Like all my writing in the past has been newsletters and blog posts and stuff like that. And those you kind of can start from zero. You don't have to make any assumptions, or you can make as many assumptions as you want. With the book, you have to have continuity. And that continuity is not easy to keep. I took 2 weeks off over the holidays. Oh my God, when I came back to try and write, I was like, where in the book am I? What does the reader know? What's going on? I luckily had some uncommitted changes that let me kick off without much research, but like I had to reread the last 3 chapters just to figure out what was going on. Because I have so much in my head around what I want to teach and what I don't want to teach and what I want to gloss over. That's been tough. In terms of the actual content, it's hard to know where to draw the line with new languages and concepts and features and stuff. I'm talking about Swift, I'm talking about Kotlin. How in depth do I have to go with unwrapping an optional? Is one line enough? Is a paragraph enough? Is an entire chapter enough? I only want to teach you the bare minimum to write the code that you're writing. But the more time I spend in the language, the less time I talk about building the features. The point of this book is to get the app built and be confident. It's not about being a Swift or a Kotlin expert. So knowing where to find that balance is tough, and knowing where to say, go here for more information and kind of like cutting it off. Same goes for stimulus and stuff like that. Like how much can I assume of the reader? Do I know that the reader is going to understand that you can do like a data colon and then give it a hash in ERB, and that's going to translate to data dash in the HTML for data controller and stuff? And I have to kind of highlight that stuff because I don't know if the reader understands that. So it's really all about what assumptions can I make and then where to drop those assumptions and just like continue on. One of the big things that I'm working on now is like, do I need a whole appendix on Swift and Xcode or Android Studio and Kotlin? Or did I introduce enough throughout the chapters that the reader will be comfortable enough that they don't need a reference? And I'm still going back and forth on that one, and it's probably going to come down to page count more than anything. But I'd love to include something like that, and maybe it's just a link on my blog. I don't know.
That's a very hard line to draw because definitely you can cover all the stuff that you write in the book for the features, but conceptually, it's like the more you can give some context so that people can translate in their heads, the more valuable the book is, the more they absorb and whatever. And you're also, I want to call out too, like as you're reading the book, you're going through doing the iOS version and then the Android version of the same feature at the same time, which is nice because you could skip the Android section or the iOS section and just do the one that applies to you. But it's helpful as you go because you're getting 2 translations of every Ruby thing where it's like, here's the iOS version of it, here's the Android version of it, and here's how it was done in Ruby. And so that I felt like it helped sync things in even a little bit further. You know, it's like trying to learn multiple languages that have the same origins. If they're all Latin based or whatever, then it's like you pick up one, then you can pick up 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever. And you're kind of doing that throughout the book. But then if you don't care at all about Android, you can just skip it and move on. And that seems good. Rather than let's build all the Rails features first and then the Android app and then the iOS app. That would be too compartmentalized. Like these all have to weave together. And I feel like the book flowed really well because you did that, where it was like, this required feature in the Rails app needs to be done first so we can use it in iOS. And then now that we've done that in iOS, it's actually pretty conceptually easy to do that in Android. So reading of this book is probably one of the more challenging books to write because you have to get that flow right because you're talking about 3 languages at the same time, more or less, or 3 frameworks or whatever you want to call it.
3 platforms.
Yeah.
That's
a challenge.
We originally, me and my editor and I had this set up as part 1, part 2. You do all the iOS app and then you do all the Android app. And there was no way to write that book without duplicating so much content. Like essentially just, and I was like, well, why am I not just writing 2 books? Why don't I just write 2 small books and then people can decide which one they want to do? But it ended up being so much duplicated effort and like keeping it in sync, of course, but it also didn't flow well. I would get to the Android chapter and I'd want to reference something from the iOS chapters, but I couldn't assume the reader had read the iOS chapter. So now I have to find a way to introduce concepts and relate them two different ways. So my writing ended up being worse because I had to write essentially not twice as much, but like 2.5 times as much. And this flow where it's like Rails, iOS, then Android works really well because of all the reasons that you called out. And it mostly follows how people build Hotwire native apps. People usually build the iOS app first and then backport features to Android where you already have the Rails scaffolding in place for that feature. And I wanted to mimic that too, because that's what I see with my client work. And that's how the book reads as well. You want to skip Android? That's fine. When you get to the Android section, turn the page to the next chapter. The only downside is that if you're doing only Android, there are some things you'll need to know from iOS, but those are called out very explicitly. Chapter 8 is like, I know I said you could skip it, but you need to read chapter 7 because that's where we introduce all this stuff. And that's the only time that you really need to read iOS if you're only doing Android.
And if you're doing that and skimming those sections because you don't need to follow along, then that's totally fine. But I went through and followed along on both throughout reading it, and it was a blast. It worked really well. It had a great flow to it, which I could tell took an enormous amount of time and effort to figure out because it just flowed as you went through feature by feature and like, hey, we kind of set ourselves up for an issue here. We added this thing, but it's not perfect. And that's important to show those things too, that we got to now tweak this so it actually works the way we want it, because you may not have ever built a mobile app before, and you might not have, like we talked about earlier, you might not even predict that's a problem or like a unintuitive thing to do on mobile.
Yeah.
And here we are. We show why and how to fix it. And it was a great book. Excited to read the final one. You said February, is that right? Hopefully it'll be.
So you can buy the early access now. And then the hard copy, the physical copy, will be out sometime later this year. There's 2 more chapters to write and edit, and then it goes through a couple rounds of review. But if you buy the early access, what's kind of labeled a beta right now, you get the PDF version, the Kindle version, and you get updates every time a new beta is released, which is about every 2 weeks, all until the final version is released. And then you get the final version as well. So you kind of just get a discount. The next beta is coming out really soon, which will include the chapter on iOS bridge components.
Nice.
Chapter 7. Yeah.
Excellent. Dude, great work on all this. I know it's been a lot of time and effort, but it's one of those things that we haven't really, I mean, we have your blog and other blog posts, but there's no, here, if you want to learn it, just grab this. And now we have an answer for that, which I think is going to be awesome.
Yeah, that's the goal. It's like, I can only write so much about this, and there's only so many blog posts you can write before you have a 10,000 word articles. This is going to be 250, 300 pages. It's a chunky book. And to have a definitive resource on, you want to build Hotwire Native, you read this book, that's the goal. And I hope that I can achieve that.
Also wanted to say, thanks for all the work you've put in on Turbo Native, Hotwire Native. Turbo Native first, right? And then now Hotwire, and all the stuff that's kind of led to like this current iteration of where we are with these libraries, because you were one of the only people I've heard in the community like really thumping about this. And I know there's a lot of companies and people out there who would love to utilize this. So thank you for all the time you've put in for all this.
Yeah, it's my career. Like, I have dedicated myself to this native space for Rails developers, and to find this hybrid framework that works so well with my mind and something that I believe in. Like, I've launched like 25 of these apps into the app stores over the years for different clients. And I've helped 15 more businesses just get their apps in the app store with like consulting or advisory or workshops and stuff. So I'm all in on this, and I want it to succeed. I think it is on a great path. And I think that this book will help solidify what it means for Rails developers to do mobile.
Yeah, and if anybody like myself who has used React Native and other things, Cordova and whatever else, all those different hybrid things. The crazy part about that is the sales pitch is like, oh, you just learn React Native and you just ship both and they're the same code base and whatever. That is not true at all. And most of the time you end up where something goes wrong and you get a big old JavaScript stack trace because the React Native actual native code broke. Good luck debugging any of that. Yeah. And when it comes down to it, you would be way better off just taking a little bit of time to learn Swift and Kotlin and the iOS and Android APIs and just doing it with pure native stuff, because then you can actually debug it. You can actually do those things. Because I know that's a question people still ask of like, well, they promise this magic with React Native or, whatever the other options are. And while maybe for something simple, that could be true. And I'm sure it's gotten a lot better since I last used it. But you were working on abstractions where with Hotwire Native, you're not. And that's the beauty of it. Because yes, you do have to learn another language or two and translate between them. But you actually have full control over it. And it's not all hidden away behind the scenes. And when something goes wrong, you can actually figure it out as opposed to just kind of being stuck. You're not going to go fork the React Native plugin for the video player and patch that and whatever. Good luck with that.
Bet.
Well, all right. Challenge accepted.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And I still recommend React Native to some clients, but it's only when they have a React front end already on top of their Rails app.
Yeah.
If you have that, you already have the APIs ready. You already have what you need. You already know it's a pain in the butt to write front end and back end code separately. So you should just write React Native and have one code base and not learn Swift and Kotlin. But if you have a traditional Rails front end, a Hotwire stack, Hotwire Native is really the way to go. And yes, like Chris said, you're going to have to learn some Swift and learn some Kotlin. But what you learn is going to be debuggable and fixable in the future by your own developers and you and your own team, not by having to deal with like opening an issue on React Native and being like, what's going on? So I am all in on this, and I think you should be too.
I like it. Awesome having you back on. Enjoy the book. Looking forward to the next betas as they come out.
Yeah.
Oh, one thing I was going to ask you is for a book like this, where you have so many dependencies like Ruby, Rails, iOS, or Xcode.
Don't stress them out, Chris. Damn.
Is that going to be something that, because there's going to be another Xcode version coming out shortly. Is that something that will have to get updated every year or something?
I'm writing it with the latest that's available at the time I hit git push equivalent, right? So, and Xcode 16, Android Studio Ladybug, Ruby 3.4.1, all the latest stuff that we have right now. Every beta that comes out, I'm going to be updating all those to make sure they're on the latest as well. But a year after the book's released, like Xcode 17 will be out. I'm hoping that book will still read the same way because it won't add a new feature that breaks something. But I think that this is one of those books that every year or so is probably going to have another edition because there's just so many different things in flux that you can't leave it out of date for too long. Otherwise, it's going to be stale. Yeah, so we're still figuring that out. But I think that I'm not using any features that are going to go away anytime soon in these. Yeah. Maybe a button will move left and right and you have to figure it out. But for the most part, you should be fine for a while.
Love it.
Cool. All right.
Thanks for having me, guys. This has been awesome.
Thanks for joining us. We will have links to your website and the book and everything in the show notes. So
thanks for having me, guys. This was awesome.
Yep.
Yeah. See ya.